seguir o caminho. Quando escuto que outros falem palavras sem sentido, quando vejo em teus olhos que não resta nenhuma lembrança, não voltar ao anoitecer, seguir o caminho, não sorrir no amanhecer, seguir o caminho.
Testing. Hi, welcome back. Wasn't that a great lunch, Aspen Insurance? Thank you very, very much. Those little chocolate tarts were just awesome. All right, we are back, and I would like to bring out a man who needs no introduction, so I won't give him one. CyberScout founder and chairman Adam Levin is up to announce our next special guest. Adam?
Thank you. Herb, I do need an introduction. Come on. Anyway, thank you all for coming. We're excited you're here. I think we've had some awesome speakers and panelists so far today, and I think you're going to be pretty excited by what our next speaker has to say. I'm pretty excited about him. So Al Franken is a friend of mine, and I think he will confirm to you that I have been stalking him for years to come and talk at our PXF conferences, and I'm very excited that I finally convinced him to say yes. So what can I tell you about Senator Franken that you may not already know? Well, first, he's a graduate of Harvard College, and as a Stanford guy, I'm giving him a pass on that. He got a perfect score, by the way, on the standardized test you have to take to get into college in this country, and that is a pretty unique feat. He's been married to his wife, Franny, who is sitting over there, for 42 years, though they still look like they're 22. They have 2 children, and they have 3 grandchildren. Now, Senator Franken was elected by the people of the state of Minnesota to the United States Senate in 2008. It was the same year that a fellow by the name of Barack Obama was elected President of the United States, and I think you will know him by the fact that he didn't do and never did 5 a.m. tweets. Senator Franken served with honor and distinction for almost a decade. He left the Senate in January of this year. A tireless truth teller, an outspoken champion of people, both those that elected him and those that weren't smart enough to elect him, but then in fact did elect him the second time around. And his election to the Senate was a realization of a lifelong dream. One of the things he said at the time was, "I was elected to be a workhorse, not a show horse." And for those of us who still believe in democracy, he was both in the most positive sense of the words. As a senator, Al Franken was a lightning rod for crucial issues, leading the fight for net neutrality, which he rightly identified as the First Amendment issue of our time. Quote from Al, "As a source of innovation, an engine of our economy, and a forum for our political discourse, the internet can only work if it's a truly level playing field. Small businesses should have the same ability to reach customers as powerful corporations. A blogger should have the same ability to reach enough to find an audience as a media conglomerate." He was a strong advocate for addressing climate change, a pressing issue that seems anathema to the current administration, to put it blandly. He was an outspoken opponent of unfettered media consolidation. Quote, "Antitrust law isn't about protecting competing businesses from each other. It's about protecting competition itself on behalf of the public." He served on these committees: Judiciary, Health, Education, Labor and Pensions, and Natural Resources, and Indian Affairs. In the Judiciary Committee, he created and was the first chairman of the Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law. And privacy has long been his passion. To quote the senator, "The institutions that we built up over the years to protect our individual privacy rights from the government don't apply to the private sector. The Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to corporations. The Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply to Silicon Valley. And you can't impeach Google if it breaks its Don't Be Evil campaign pledge." He also said, "Our laws need to reflect the evolution of technology and the changing expectations of American society. This is why the Constitution is often called a living document." He fought to make the funding of elections more fair and open. of Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that changed the way politicians got their money, he said, "Corporations are not people. Elections should not be auctions, and we refuse to allow our democracy to be put up for sale." He was an early and vocal critic of social networking platforms for their failure to identify and block Russian disinformation efforts during the 2016 election designed to undermine faith in democracy in the United States. And I quote, "How did Facebook, which prides itself on being able to process billions of data points and constantly transform them into personal connections for its user, somehow not make the connection that electoral ads paid for in rubles were coming from Russia? Those are two data points, American political ads and Russian money, rubles. How could you not connect those two dots?" The senator asked, and I imagine most Americans agreed with him when he said, quote, "The government has a responsibility to ensure that these corporations do not endanger our national security, our democracy, or our fundamental freedoms." The senator's first election, he took on a very tough incumbent in 2008, and it was the closest election in terms of a percentage point basis in the history of the United States Senate. However, when he ran for re-election, he won by more than 10 percentage points. Before entering politics, Senator Franken was an award-winning comedy writer and author. As one of the original writers of Saturday Night Live, with which I believe all of you are familiar, he received 5 Emmy Awards, and 4 of his books have been #1 New York Times bestsellers. For me, Senator Franken is both an inspiration and a hero. And now, think about these 2 quotes, and how can you not love a guy that says this? First, when you encounter seemingly good advice that contradicts other seemingly good advice, ignore them both. And second, it's easier to put on slippers than to carpet the whole world. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you one of America's great citizens and one of America's great United States senators, Al Franken.
Thank you. Well, that was too kind. It's great to be here. By the way, this is the session for anyone who has questions about compliance with and the enforcement of the GDPR. It was a long plane flight over here, and I read the thing. So if you have any questions, now's the time. Okay, good. No, this GDPR seems like a really good thing for the EU, for people here in Europe. Maybe not so good for American companies that collect and process the data here in Europe. So we'll see you in court. That's my message from America. It's really impressive to see Europe tackling one of the most complex issues involved in tech policy, how to protect people's privacy. Over in the US, we've had kind of a hard time of that lately, getting a little bit more publicity of late. The whole election thing with the Russians and Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. And today I wanted to talk about a few of the issues that this whole ordeal has raised for tech companies, for policymakers, and for ordinary people. And chief among those issues is something that has been near and dear to my heart for a long time, and that is the flow of information and misinformation in our democracies. It's no coincidence that this has become a greater concern on as social media becomes more and more important source for news for voters. Today, 2/3 of Americans get at least some of their news from social media, from outlets like Facebook and Twitter, and unfortunately, when they are on social media, what they read is too often fake news. Now, when President Trump uses the term fake news, he's using it to refer to any news story he doesn't like, especially news stories that happen to be absolutely true. But the term originally referred to actual fake news, stories that were entirely made up, propaganda designed to influence political outcomes by convincing people of things that simply are not true. I'll give you one prominent example, Pizzagate. Now, for those of you who are blessed enough not to be familiar with Pizzagate, there is a pizza joint in Washington, D.C. called Comet Pizza. And according to the Pizzagate theory, Hillary Clinton and her campaign chairman, John Podesta, used its basement as a hub for a child sex ring. This story was invented after John Podesta's emails were hacked by the Russians and released by Wikipedia. A couple of alt-right bloggers concluded that there were code words in emails between Podesta and Hillary Clinton. For example, cheese pizza, they decided, must have been code for child porn. Cheese pizza, CP, child porn, CP. It sounds ridiculous, but this conspiracy theory was shared and retweeted widely, and it spread like wildfire through conservative fever swamps. And some guy even showed up at Comet Pizza and shot the place up in an effort to rescue the child sex slaves he was convinced were locked in the basement. Now, to be clear, social media didn't invent lying or conspiracy theories. Indeed, there's nothing new about political actors trying to mislead the public. 15 years ago, I wrote a book called Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, a fair and balanced look at the right, in which I explored what I saw as an orchestrated effort by right-wing media outlets like Fox News to insert misinformation into American political discourse. Back then, though, it was considered scandalous, or at least rude, to use words like lies or lying or liars. Today, that seems almost quaint. And while a big part of the blame for that belongs to those who seek to mislead, the fact is that American tech companies like Facebook and Twitter have made it easier for political actors and even foreign countries like Russia to spread misinformation. And this isn't just unfair to the campaign being lied about, it does real damage to the democratic process itself. During the 2016 campaign, Americans went on Facebook, and right at the top of their news feeds, they saw fake stories in fake Facebook groups run by fake neighbors who were in fact sitting in an office building in St. Petersburg. Right next to those stories, they saw fake election ads tailored precisely for people like them, ads that were invisible to everyone else. And over on Twitter, they saw the same fake stories retweeted by armies of fake Twitter users along with a bunch of real ones. Now, you don't have to be upset by Trump's victory to be troubled by what this kind of widespread information can do to a democracy. If we can't have a political discourse where we agree on basic objective facts, things like what's in a tax bill, or what's happening to our climate, or whether prominent politicians are running child sex rings out of the basement of pizza places, then our democratic government will continue to be polarized and paralyzed. And that plays right into the hands of those who wish to see democracies like the United States fall into decay and dysfunction. Now, look, I like social media. I like technology. It's amazing. But I believe these companies also have a responsibility to help protect the people who use their products. And I believe that policymakers have a responsibility to hold those companies accountable when they fall short. 2016 was a massive failure on both counts. Now, I'm not just here to cast blame. I'm here because I don't want to see it happen again. After all, what happened in the 2016 presidential election wasn't some kind of fluke. It was a deliberate effort by the Russians to take advantage of systemic problems in our information ecosystem. If we do not act to address these problems, all of this will happen again, maybe at the hands of the Russians, maybe at the hands of a private company like Cambridge Analytica, or maybe at the hands of other bad actors. And so today, I want to look back at how we got here and look ahead at what we can do to change things. Early in my Senate career, as Adam said, I was given the opportunity to create a new subcommittee as part of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I chose to create and chair what would be called the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law. To be honest, when I arrived in the Senate, I had no background in privacy or technology or the law, actually. I had been a comedy writer and an author, but I created the subcommittee because I saw that tech companies were collecting enormous quantities of personal information, and that in a lot of cases there were really no rules for governing what they could do with that data or what their responsibilities were to the people it belonged to. Now, I'll give you an example. Stalking apps. In 2011, I held my first hearing on geolocation data that pinpoints people's movement in the physical world. At that hearing, I asked Google and Apple to explain how they were protecting their customers' geolocation information. It might have sounded like pretty esoteric stuff until you understand what that meant for real people. I heard from the Minnesota Coalition of Battered Women, an organization whose mission is to protect the victims of domestic violence. They told me that across Minnesota and the country, victims of domestic violence were being stalked and followed by their abusers through apps on their smartphones. They told me a story about a woman from northern Minnesota that has stuck with me ever since. The woman had secretly gone to a domestic violence office in a county building to get help. But a few minutes after she arrived, her smartphone lit up with a text message. It was her abuser who said, "Why are you in the county building? Are you at the domestic violence office?" She panicked, and so an advocate from the program took her to the courthouse to get a restraining order. As soon as she filed the restraining order, she got a second text from her abuser. "Why are you at the courthouse? Are you filing a restraining order against me?" The advocates later figured out that the woman was being tracked through a stalking app that he had installed on her phone. I started investigating further, and I was startled to find that this wasn't some kind of freak accident. This was a pattern. Every year, thousands of women were being stalked or harassed through the use of stalking apps, and some were being assaulted and even, yes, killed. There was a whole industry of these apps. They were freely available online, and these apps were pretty clear about their purpose. Here's a quote from one of them. "Flexi Spy gives you total control of your partner's phone without them knowing it. See exactly where they are or were at any given time and date," unquote. I started to wonder, how on earth is this happening? Now, look, there have been stalkers longer than there have been stalking apps. But while American federal law does prohibit stalking someone, it does not clearly prohibit secretly tracking someone's geolocation or even require that an app company ask for your permission before collecting or sharing your geolocation data. So I offered a bill to close both of these legal loopholes. It was called the Location Privacy Protection Act. And while we passed it out of the Judiciary Committee, it never became law. The tech industry lobbied hard to stop my bill. In 2012, for every advocacy group that lobbied in favor of my bill, almost 30 companies or industry groups lobbied against it. Now, this is not a coincidence. In the last decade, the lobbying budgets of the tech companies have exploded. Now, here comes my PowerPoint. Okay, it's a PowerPoint because it has one point. It's one slide with one point. This is what the tech sector spent on lobbying between 2000 and 2016, and you'll see this spike starting after 2009, which coincidentally was when the last major new consumer privacy bill was passed into law. What happened to my location bill is more or less what happened to every other major piece of privacy legislation after 2009. Now, let me give you another more recent example. Enough of the slide. You can only absorb a slide for so long. Take the slide down. There. Okay, thank you. Let me give you another more recent example. Remember when Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress last month? Well, he was promising to do better on privacy, and he kept on saying that face recognition was one kind of technology that should require special consent from users. He actually said this 3 times. Well, what Zuckerberg left out was that while he was testifying, lobbyists backed by Facebook were working with Illinois state legislators backed by Facebook to effectively gut the nation's strongest face recognition law. This is the kind of stuff that Facebook and other internet companies do to paralyze American privacy laws. Why am I telling you this? Well, I want to give you a sense of why the U.S. has such weak consumer privacy laws in place, but I'm also telling you about what happened to my location privacy bill because Congress's failure to protect people's information, a failure the tech industry spent a lot of money to enable, helped create the conditions for the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Facebook talks about Cambridge Analytica and Alexander Kogan as if they were isolated bad actors who swooped into Facebook with a rogue app in 2014. But as we know from Sandy Parakilas, who spoke earlier, and I thought he was great, the vulnerabilities that Cambridge Analytica and Kogan exploited were well known within Facebook and within the developer community. In mid-2012, Sandy actually gave a presentation to other Facebook executives where he pointed out that data brokers and foreign governments could exploit these vulnerabilities to harvest their users' data. But Facebook didn't do anything about it until years later. Facebook says that 87 million users had their data harvested by Kogan's app. Sandy says that's a drop in the bucket. He explains that a majority of Facebook users, we're talking about now hundreds of millions of people here, likely have had their data harvested by an app like the one used by Kogan. Why didn't Facebook do anything? Why did it take so long? I think it's because they knew that they could get away with it. And Facebook knew that third-party apps were driving a lot of users to their site. As Sandy recently wrote, quote, "What I saw was a company that prioritized data collection from its users over protecting them from abuse." So I believe that what happened with Cambridge Analytica wasn't an accident. It was an exploitation of Facebook's business model. This business model made Facebook a lot of money, but it left users vulnerable to having their data taken by companies that they'd never heard of. For too long, Congress failed to put anything into place to prevent this practice, and by the time we realized just how dangerous this situation was, it was far too late. So my perspective on what happened in the 2016 election comes partly from my time as chair of the Senate Judiciary Privacy Subcommittee, but it also stems from my work on the Antitrust Subcommittee, where I explored many of these same companies that were mistreating their users' data we're also abusing their power as platforms. Now, most people interact with Facebook and Google as users, but these companies are, at the end of the day, advertisers. We are not their customers, we are their products. Last year, Facebook made $9.3 billion in the second quarter, with 98% of that coming from the advertising business. Google made $26 billion for the same quarter, with 87% of that coming from advertising. But these companies aren't just advertisers. They are the world's biggest online ad companies. Facebook and Google have a combined 60 to 70% share of the digital advertising market, a strong duopoly. To build and maintain this dominant position in the market, both companies have engaged in a wide range of behavior, some of which appears pretty routine, but may have long consequences for users, innovation, and our democracy. In the past decade, Facebook has developed a pattern of buying up innovative startups to expand its data collection capabilities and eliminate potential competition. They also ripped off their rivals' ideas when acquisitions weren't possible. A few years ago, Facebook wanted to buy Snapchat, which was gaining popularity. Snapchat repeatedly turned them down. So instead, Facebook simply cloned Snapchat's most recognizable feature by adding a stories function to Instagram, which it already owned. Pretty soon, Snapchat users and advertisers were jumping ship. The big-time tech investors took notice too. Soon after Facebook launched its stories function, the Washington Post interviewed a dozen top venture capitalists who reported that one of the first questions they ask when hearing pitches from app entrepreneurs is how easy it would be for Facebook to copy the idea. A partner at a top U.S. investment firm said, quote, "We don't touch anything that comes too close to Facebook, Google, or Amazon, which is to say we don't think our companies should fly too close to the sun." As Facebook and Google have gotten bigger and bigger, they've lost all incentive to act in their users' best interest because, well, their users have nowhere else to go. Facebook has acquired its competitors and integrated itself into so many aspects of our lives that the company has made it nearly impossible for users to leave. I'm sure many of you watched the Zuckerberg hearings. The part that stuck out to me was Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, Senator Graham, asked Mark Zuckerberg a simple but very smart question: who is your biggest competitor? And Zuckerberg couldn't really answer him. Facebook doesn't have to care about the privacy and security of their users' online information because there's no mass exodus when it violates those values. They have no real competitors in the eyes of users who don't feel that they can walk away. And that means users have no defense. Unfortunately, neither do the content creators who rely on Google and Facebook's platforms to reach eyes. The two companies currently control 75% of all internet news traffic referrals, meaning that 3 out of 4 times an internet user accesses a news story online, they get there through Facebook or Google. This gives them unprecedented power, not only over how content is delivered to their users, but also the kind of content that people are putting on the internet to begin with. Facebook and Google's algorithms and optimization policies are driving journalists to write stories that they know will be promoted on Google search, on news feeds, and in the trending section of Facebook. During the 2016 election, journalists and editors were under extreme pressure not to write the most thorough or carefully considered story, but one that would get the most clicks. And that brings me back to where I started with what's happened to the flow of information in my country. You can blame the Russians for helping Donald Trump win a close election, but I think you can argue that he is in many ways the inevitable result of an information culture where clicks equal money. To quote Franklin Foer, a print journalist formerly of the New Republic, "Once Trump became a plausible candidate, media had no choice but to cover him, but media had carried him to that point. Stories about Trump yielded the sort of traffic that pleased the gods of data and benefited the bottom line," unquote. Now, to be fair to social media, early Trump kind of did pretty well on TV as well. For whatever his other flaws, Donald Trump is a hell of a showman. And he specializes in exactly the kind of bombast that drives traffic, fear, anger, negativity. Stuff that gets your attention and riles up your blood. Facebook, like Google and Twitter, has said that it never could have foreseen Russia's manipulation of its platforms to spread propaganda and sow discord among Americans. I find this really hard to believe, because that's one of the things that platforms like Facebook are really good at. Advertisers like Russia can pay Facebook to reach exactly the people they want to reach and no one else. So the content on users' news feeds has the effect of confirming the beliefs that they already hold and amplifying the biases that drive them apart. And that's exactly what Russia did. Russia's Internet Research Agency bought at least 3,000 Facebook ads. Those ads often promoted content from fake Facebook groups like Heart of Texas, LGBT United, Army of Jesus, United Muslims of America, and Woke Blacks. Because Facebook has so much information about its users, the Russians were able to precisely target those ads on the basis of people's social networks, geographic locations, and their beliefs on immigrant rights, gun laws, racial justice, same-sex marriage, and on and on. And they targeted the ads to incite people to vote for Trump on the one hand and to depress turnout for Hillary. Among key groups like African Americans, young women, and very liberal Democrats. Here's a quote from Woke Blacks. This is from their Woke Blacks accounts targeted at African Americans who lived in places like Detroit, Philadelphia, and Milwaukee. Quote, "Particular hype and hatred for Trump is misleading people and forcing blacks to vote for Hillary," with a K. "We cannot resort to the lesser of two devils. Then we'd surely be better off without voting at all," unquote. That was a subtle message to African Americans not to vote. Finally, because Facebook's algorithm advantages posts that attract your attention, these negative inflammatory messages were rewarded with more and more views and eventually being shown to well over 100 million people. The Russians didn't game Facebook's system. They used it in exactly the way it was built to be used. And they didn't even try to hide it. They paid in rubles. Russia's success in undermining our democratic process in 2016 was dependent, at least in part, on weaponizing the platforms of a few companies that were too big to care or even notice that it was happening. Mark Zuckerberg is back on what has been called his 14-year apology tour. You see, Facebook has a pattern of begging for forgiveness rather than asking for permission. The company simply acknowledges its mistakes and then moves on without really addressing its negligence. And thus far, Congress and even the public has largely moved on too. So I hope Cambridge Analytica, as well as the Russian meddling in the 2016 election, leads to a genuine shift in culture at Facebook and Google and our other tech giants, but I don't think that we can or should count on it. So where does that leave us, aside from kind of bummed out? Well, at the end of the day, companies only act in the public interest instead of their own interest for one of two reasons. Either market forces force them to do it, or the government compels them to. And unfortunately, the bigger these companies get, the harder it is for either the market or government to do that. But it's only more important that we try. Now, there's no silver bullet to fix where we are, but there are important steps that we can take to protect users' online privacy, promote competition in the tech sector, and most importantly, secure the integrity of our democracy in America. You're doing it pretty well here with the GDPR. I think these steps will make a difference. Now, there is some low-hanging fruit here. We need transparency around election ads. When you see an election ad online, you should know who paid for it and why you are seeing it. When Facebook releases its promised and highly anticipated political ads archive, it should also include the ad buyer's target criterion. Why has this been targeted to you? Information on the kinds of people the ad was shown to. We also deserve accountability from these companies when they make commitments to do better. I look forward to the Federal Trade Commission's investigation into whether Facebook violated its consent decree with the agency when it let Alexander Kogan harvest the personal information of 87 million users and then pass that on to Cambridge Analytica. But now that Facebook has made another round of promises to verify political advertisers' identities, the government should hold them to those promises. Second, we must restore Americans' right to privacy to ensure that the tech sector's mistreatment of our data doesn't get even worse. Cambridge Analytica pilfered reams of personal information on millions of Americans. Those Americans only found out that they are personally impacted by it on the morning of the first Zuckerberg hearing when they opened their accounts to discover a special message from Facebook. That's crazy. It should not take 4 years for a company to tell you that they gave away your data. Strong, simple rules that force companies to tell you what they know about you and give you meaningful choices about what they tell others might help stop a future scandal like this. With the implementation of the GDPR later this month, I think we'll have a real opportunity to see what works and what doesn't and apply some of those lessons to the United States. If Facebook and other tech companies start treating Europeans far better than they're treating Americans, Americans will notice, and so hopefully will Congress. Finally, we need to look at how to stop these companies from getting even bigger and more powerful so that they're even more unaccountable, not just to regulators, but to the free market itself. Promoting competition can start with better enforcement of the laws that we already have on the books. U.S. antitrust enforcers should closely scrutinize tech giants' acquisitions of potential competitors. These are often smaller startups like Instagram and WhatsApp once were. They may not hold a significant share of the market at the time of a deal, but they hold a potential to more meaningfully compete in the future. We may also need to rethink the standard by which U.S. antitrust enforcers examine anti-competitive behavior and deals when users are paying for services with their data and not their dollars. When measuring only the economic cost to consumers simply doesn't make sense. When considering a tech giant's conduct or acquisition in the market of information, our privacy, our access to quality news and information, and the integrity of our democracy should matter. If enforcers can't use our current laws to protect these values, then I agree it's time to re-examine them. We all spend a lot of time marveling at what these new technologies can bring in terms of opportunity. We should also spend time reckoning with the challenges it poses. For years, advocates have raised concerns about how today's dominant platforms have misused our private information and engaged in anti-competitive behavior. And yet for years, American lawmakers and regulators have failed to act. The 2016 election It can be the reckoning we never knew we needed. It can be the moment when lawmakers in the United States finally address the anxiety that's been building for decades for the past decade, about our online privacy and the tech giants' unmatched power. I hope it will be. There's too much at stake not to use this moment as a catalyst for action. And now with that, I'm ready to take your questions on the GDPR. Thank you. And we're going to do some question and answer. Want me over here?
Thank you, Senator Franken. It says here, that was wonderful. It says it right here. Actually, it was. It was really wonderful. Adam and I are going to ask you a couple of questions, and we'll start with the senior member of the delegation, Adam. Should be on.
Hello? Yes, okay. So, Senator, question number one is, could the Cambridge Analytica Facebook privacy problem have been averted by the correct legislation, and have there been bills that may have hindered it from actually happening?
Well, there was no existing legislation that would have stopped it from happening. GDPR has an opt-in in it, and you know, my geolocation bill that I talked about, the reason it went down was I had an opt-in. So, and the tech companies didn't like that, and this was an early iteration of an opt-in. And, but basically what happened here is Kogan puts this is your digital life app on Facebook. What was it, 270,000 users downloaded it, and Kogan gets the data from the 270,000 people, but he also gets it from their friends. And that's, if you had an opt-in, my assumption would be that the friends would have to opt in. So Kogan would have had to contact every friend, and so you wouldn't have gotten the 87 million. That's one way to do it. The other is to hold Facebook responsible for looking the other way. What Sandy said earlier was this happened all the time, and they looked the other way all the time. He had asked them to look into it, and they wouldn't do it. And if you said, you know, if Facebook finds out that its policies have been violated, it has to do something about it, and it has to inform the people whose data has been taken right away within, I don't know, the GDPR has, what, 72 hours or something? Yeah. Which seems impossible, but.
Well, just remember when, you know, Facebook sent people a notice saying, you know, look for Zuck doing his congressional testimony on the day it happened. So they have the capability of communicating pretty instantly.
Oh, they can communicate instantly. I don't know how you find out the 87 million instantly. Maybe they can.
They had a pretty good idea pretty quickly.
Senator, I've covered this issue for 10 years now, and I'm a realist, which is basically a pessimist. Americans aren't Europeans. We don't value our privacy like they do over here. Mm-hmm. I can't see how Congress will ever act unless the American people demand it, which we haven't. I mean, we got all upset about Facebook, and 2 weeks later we're worried about something else, and they have more members than they had before. Their stock is back up again. You know, we moan and whine, but we really haven't demanded that our lawmakers give us some privacy regulations.
Well, I hope this is a wake-up call, but you're right. I mean, I am pessimistic about this. And that one slide I showed is one of the reasons. Unfortunately, in the United States, lobbying and money is very important in our elections. And that's why Citizens United was such an important decision. And so there's massive money that goes into our elections, and I think that's something that really hurts the people in our country.
Now, for people from the EU, I don't know how many of you really know what the Citizens United case was all about, but it was about should there be limitations on corporations for contributing to political campaigns?
Yes. Technically, they can't give to political campaigns, but they can give this what's called dark money. The Koch brothers and others in the United States put billions of dollars into our campaigns, and they have to be independent of the campaign.
Independent, yeah.
Independent, yeah.
Term of art.
Yes.
So, and that really turned politics in the United States on its ear because of this just staggering
Well, I mean,
flow.
if you look at something like climate change, I mentioned the Koch brothers, they're in the fossil fuel industry, and that's where most of their money comes from. Republicans used to believe that there was climate change, or a number of them, but now if they acknowledge that there's climate change, they know they'll be primaried by the Koch brothers, that there'll be a lot of money going against them, and there'll be some Republican who's even more conservative and more willing to say that climate change doesn't exist. And this is another reason why Europe is so far ahead of us on this.
Senator, I want to follow up on the point you were making about the size of these companies. Are we at the point where you're calling for maybe the breaking up of some of these companies, an investigation of monopolistic practices?
I'm basically saying that we need to look at these companies in a different way when they have mergers and when they add new products.
And incidentally, as a side note, for those of you who do believe that there really is a climate change issue, I recommend to you the movie Geostorm. That's kind of an awakening for people. Senator, do you consider fake news and the swaying of voters via social media to be a cybersecurity issue?
Okay, that sounds like a philosophical question, depending on what you think cybersecurity is, or how you define it. But let me say one thing. In the middle of that is the swaying of votes on social media. Is that a cybersecurity issue?
Yes.
I think when it's not transparent, when Russia's doing what it was doing, that's a cybersecurity issue to me. But it's perfectly legitimate, and I think it's a good thing to try to sway votes on social media. Social media has been great in so many ways. The Women's March on Washington, that was started in a Facebook group by a woman in Hawaii. And so a lot of these movements, the Parkland students after that massacre, they used Facebook to organize the March of Our Lives. Facebook and Google did this online day of action for net neutrality, an issue you mentioned that I care a lot about. And so that's legitimate. Now, fake news, in the United States we have the First Amendment. And it's the First Amendment, it's number one in America, which is also number one. No, okay. Europeans. I think that there are some companies, American companies, that are reticent to take down fake news because they think that's a First Amendment issue, but I don't think it is. Like, one of the pieces of fake news that was that went the most viral was Pope endorses Donald Trump. And he didn't.
Certainly not.
No, he didn't. And that was demonstrably false. And it seems to me that they had, any platform had the right to take that down. Now, hate speech is also something that they take down. And there's the other wrinkle on fake news is satire. Okay, because I've seen this. I've seen really pernicious fake news put on social media, and then whoever put it up will say, when they're outed, will say it's satire.
Playing the satire get out of jail free card.
Yeah, and you kind of go, what was the joke?
So final question, we have a minute left. Now that we don't have net neutrality basically in the U.S. anymore, what do you predict is going to happen? The companies say we won't do anything. I don't think we can trust them. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, first of all, it has to go through the courts. So the courts upheld the net neutrality rule that the last FCC promulgated. And I think that we'll see what the courts do. But if it doesn't, I think that's a very, very bad thing. I think it's a very bad day that happened. And this FCC has just been terrible in every respect.
All right.
One last, Herb, just one very fast question.
Yeah.
And it's the one I think that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts is, how secure do you think the American election system really is at this moment?
Oh, I think it's completely secure, and we have nothing to worry about.
I feel better.
Comedy writer.
No. I think that it isn't secure, and I worry about that a lot. We all know it was pretty universal. It was completely universal among the intelligence community that the Russians tried hacking like 30 or so of the state's voter registration storals, and that I think they penetrated 2 of them, and that they'll be back, or they've never left, I'm sure. And so we need to make sure those are secure. I know that your company is doing that, right? You're in a couple of the states. Now, people should know that are American that our elections are run by the states. So we have 51 systems, including DC. And that means that the Russians have 51 targets. And we don't let the federal government run the elections. That's constitutionally what the founders did. And I think that's a good thing, because if you don't want the elections run by the White House. So I think that, I'm not a technologist, as I think is pretty obvious, but we have to have some kind of uniform standards for states to make sure that they secure themselves. And whether that's, what do you call it, penetration testing and independent penetration testing, we need to do that. I think we got a very late start on it, considering knowing what happened in 2016.
No, and I think as a final note on that, a lot of people go, well, they got into anywhere from 2 to 39 states, depending upon, how people look at it. But the bottom line is you don't need to nail 22 states in order to undermine democracy for elections in the United States. All you need is one county, maybe even one very large municipality, or like New York City, where if voting results were called into question, you could really strike fear into the hearts of most Americans, wondering if it happened there, can it happen where I live?
And I think that is a goal of the Russians more than almost anything, which is to undermine faith in our democracy. That seems to be their number one goal, and they could do a county in a battleground state, Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin, and in a close election, and that could actually make the difference in an election.
Senator, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you being here today. Everyone, Senator Al Franken.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. That was fantastic. It says it right here. That was fantastic. No, right here. See? Fantastic. Actually, it's phenomenal. Thank you very, very much. I'm just being a wise guy because he's a comedian. I mean, sometimes. All right. It is now time for us to explore the world of forensics. And we're going to talk about now the world of forensics and understand the tactics that hackers are using the most to influence things and do their dirty work. Eric Hodge is CyberScout's Director of Cyber Solutions. We're going to call Eric up. And Eric has been helping organizations for more than 2 decades establish and build their cybersecurity practices. And Andrzej Krail, CEO and founder of Lifers. For over 2 decades, Andrzej has been focusing on computer cybersecurity and forensics. Eric, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and take it away. Hard act to follow there.
That's easy. He's only won 5 Emmys. Yeah, that's fine. Good. Well, thanks for having us. We're excited to talk to you a little bit today about how forensics work. As Herb said, I'm Eric Hodge. This is Andre. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how forensics works in a breach response, in the breach response world, how we think about it, how we go about it, the kind of the boring how-tos. Then Andre gets to tell you the sexy stories about some actual breaches and some real-world stuff that's really happening.